Hello and welcome to another sneaker video. Today we have a shoe that's one of my personal favorites and the shoe that got me started in collecting sneakers. It was the very first shoe I ever bought with my own money when I had one of my first jobs at an Old Navy in upstate New York back in the late 90s. That sneaker is none other than the Adidas Oswego 2 from 1997. I remember wearing them everywhere and they were quite popular at the time. There was no hype, no limited colors or releases, and no ridiculous price tags, so they were pretty accessible to anyone who wanted a pair. You'd find them at the gym, on casual runners, and on people doing everyday things from going to work or school or running errands. At least that's my memory of them. The original Oswego was first introduced in 1996 as a lightweight runner. It still had some design elements from earlier Adidas models, but atop a new foam midsole with Adidas cushioning for added comfort in the forefoot. And I've never owned a pair of the originals, and from what I've seen, they're fairly rare. And while I like Adidas runners from the 80s and early 90s, they never appealed to me the way that other brands' runners did from that era. And that changed in 1997 with the introduction of the Oswego 2. The Adidas technology and midsole remained largely the same, but the uppers got a sleek upgrade. So gone were the days of the plain and rather outdated Adidas uppers like those of the ZX series from the 80s, or shoes like the Torsion Advanced C from 1994. The designs would be more complex, but with sleeker and longer rounded lines, much more aesthetically pleasing to the mid to late 90s consumers. And they would incorporate lots of mesh and synthetic leather, which has unfortunately cracked by now in 2023. And the following year, Adidas would introduce the Oswego 3, another classic in the line. The design was even bolder than the 2, with more of a chunky, bubbled look, and the introduction of Adidas Plus in the forefoot for added bounce, as well as the Adidas torsion system in the midsole to connect the Adidas Plus to the regular Adidas, which was moved to the heel. I had a pair in high school which I loved, but I still kept my Oswego 2s, and I found my 3s in a box years ago, but threw them out due to mold and deteriorating uppers, and looking back I wish I'd kept them or at least tried to restore them a bit. They were the white, navy blue, and yellow model, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, and you can still find them on places like eBay, but chances are the synthetic portions are cracked and peeling, and the seller will probably still want to charge you $150 plus for men's sizes. The Oswego 4 came out in 99 or 2000, which marked my final year of high school, and it combined elements of the previous models in terms of tech, but the design of the uppers looks more like a late 90s modernization of the Oswego 1. And where I grew up, and maybe where you did too, the turn of the millennium was a great time for Adidas. Everyone was wearing Superstars and Oswegos and many other popular models of the day. I remember the Pro models, and Adidas even updated the Stan Smith and Superstar, giving them some added bulk and padding, adding Millennium to their names. In fact, the Superstar Millennium was everywhere in those days, if you remember them. It was a great time for many other brands as well, if you're a collector like me, or just have fond memories of the fashions of that time. It was a time of new tech and a lot of it, especially in cushioning and lightweight materials, as well as all new designs and upgrades or nods to classics. And this was throughout the 90s, but focusing here on the late 90s, whether it was Adidas Adidas or Nike Air, full-length Air, Reebok DMX, something like Asics Gel, New Balance Absorb, or Puma Cell, or just crazy designs from companies like Fila. It was all about more, it was all about bigger and better. Of course, people were still wearing their classics like Nike Air Force Ones and Reebok Classic Leathers, but the 90s were very much about pushing the envelope. And from what I recall, the Adidas craze kind of died down a couple of years after that. Maybe it's because I moved, but I feel sneaker innovation across the brands was never really the same, or at least never really as exciting. Brands came to rely heavily on 70s, 80s, and 90s retros, which we're still seeing today, of course, though the quality sadly has generally declined. And in case you're wondering, there was an Oswego 5, but I had a difficult time finding a decent photo. Never owned a pair, and looks-wise, they were a far cry from the original line. Another sneaker I absolutely loved from the late 90s was the Nike Air Max Triax, and their 1997 model was one of my favorites. In terms of Adidas, there were many amazing models back at the time, from shoes like the Falcon to the Response, the odd-looking but popular Response Trail, if you remember those, the Galaxy, the Adidas Universal, and God, many, many more. Around 2002, the Oswego 2 got a retro and became the Oswego Classic, and a few years after that, it got a slightly new design and became the Oswego Millennium. Unfortunately, the Oswego 2 has not been retroed since then in its original form. In 2013, designer Raf Simons created his own version of the Oswego, but it never rivaled the original line in my eyes. It was way too bulky and overpriced for me, and probably many other people out there. And then in 2019, Adidas released a new Oswego model, somewhat based on the Oswego 3, but again, it didn't really appeal to me, so I never purchased a pair. I mean, they're not bad, and I think they sold pretty well. They capture some of that late 90s design, but I would have preferred a return of one of the original 4 models. And in terms of my own collection, I never wear my original 2s from 1997, and the issue with them and many other shoes from back then is the synthetic material. As I said earlier, it lasts about 15 years, and then it starts to crack and flake off. And I think I said it in another video, but you can remove it. You can scrape it off or peel it off, and you'll be left with a kind of a felt-like material underneath, kind of like a tennis ball. Sometimes I don't mind that, but for this pair, my very first pair of sneakers, I'd rather they stay as close to their original form as possible. My favorite pair is the Oswego Classic from 2002. It's my favorite pair that I own, and I've worn them a couple of times and can sense the synthetic leather at the front wants to crack. It's only a matter of time, so I'm gonna be gentle with them. There are synthetic leather cleaners and conditioners out there, which might be worth trying if I'm gonna preserve any of these older shoes. And if you're looking for a brand new pair of these, you can sometimes find them on eBay, but prices vary. I've seen sellers asking for as little as 40 or 50 bucks up to about 200. And the same goes for the original 90s pairs, especially the Oswego 3s, but they are even more likely to be damaged. Now, this used 2004 pair is cracking and flaking in some places, but aren't doing too bad for their age. Slightly used pairs can be pretty inexpensive, but you might want to ask the seller about the condition of the uppers. It's also not uncommon for the older rubber outsoles to become kind of unglued in some places, but you can usually re-glue them if you're up for it, if you use something like barge cement. Next, we have a pair of Oswego Millenniums from 2008. These I like, but they have a lot of mesh, which can rip and tear easily sometimes. We also have a lot of synthetic leather again, but these should hold up for a few more years, hopefully, especially with some care, so I might throw on some of that synthetic leather cleaner and conditioner on these. And you can find these online every now and then, and again, prices vary. I think I got mine for about $60 1 or 2 years ago, wasn't too long ago. Lastly, we have this pair of original 1999 Oswego 4s in white, yellow, and gray, and some black. And while the synthetic leather portions in white have held up, the gray piece, the gray tag on the tongue has flaked and stained the white fabric underneath. That's another thing with the synthetic material. Once it flakes, it can stain nearby material. If it's something that's black that's flaking and it's next to something white, watch out, because yeah, it's gonna stain that white portion. And I wore these to the gym and they felt pretty good. It's not a shoe I've come across very much online, and I don't think there's ever been much of a demand for them as there are for the 2s and 3s, but I'm glad I was able to get a pair. So do you remember the Oswego line from back in the day? Did you own a pair? Do you wish Adidas would retro them again? I mean, I wish Adidas would retro some of their classic 90s running shoes, much like New Balance and Asics have done. So yeah, that's it for this video. Leave a comment and feel free to subscribe. You can check out my Instagram at Kevin15776, where I post fairly regularly. And if you have any questions on these shoes or any others, feel free to ask. I usually reply pretty quickly. And with all this being said, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.